All right. And so we'll go to my colleague, Ms. Vecchio, for 7 minutes.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for this bill. I will be supporting this bill, but there's a few things that I just want to get some data and information on. And so when we're looking at the preamble, on page 1, line 24 through 29, you indicate, whereas the effects of poverty and vulnerability are exacerbated by limited access for women and their families to affordable housing. If you could give me data on that, I recognize it is an issue because they're dealing with different issues, but what exactly are you referring to as limited access?
Thank you very much for that question, Ms. Vecchio, and thank you also for your support for this bill at first and second reading. As you can appreciate, a private member's bill is not an opportunity to do exhaustive research. Data is very important, and we've really very carefully developed a set of preambles that is supported by data, but that also doesn't become too statistically driven, and it's open for interpretation and open for emphasis again in our various writings, depending on what initiatives we like to pursue during Gender Equality Week. This information actually came to us from Women's College Hospital. I can certainly provide the exact written feedback from that group to the committee if that's helpful. The focus there was primarily, but not exclusively, mental health, access to mental health.
Absolutely, that would be, but would we find the same access? Yeah, send that us our way, that would be wonderful. I want to go on to page 2. We're looking at page 2, line 8 and 9. And just, I would look at this, whereas Canadian women face barriers in pursuing and completing post-secondary education. Just looking at that specific part. Now, the testimony that we have heard through our study is we're showing that 61% of post-secondary graduates in Canada are actually women. And we also are showing that we are seeing an increase in levels of people going into their master's and PhD as well. But what are these barriers that you're showing, yet we see that the statistics do not support that? So can you provide the data or the research that you have on that, please?
Absolutely. There's two aspects to that. First of all, this preambular paragraph really is aimed at the STEM field, and I think the data there is strongly supported and strongly out there. But the other aspect of this was that this was a preambular paragraph that captured comments from our Indigenous women. Access to education is a particular, not just access, but completing post-secondary education is a particular aspect in the North. We chose not to narrow it in the preamble to Indigenous women to make sure that we capture the STEM side of it as well.
Okay.
But it pivots to both STEM and Indigenous communities in the far North.
Okay.
And there the problem is particularly completion of post-secondary education.
For Indigenous,
yes.
Specific. Okay. Line 2, or page 2, line 18 through 23, we're talking about obstacles where women are not being recognized for their prior work when they come as newcomers. Is there data showing that newcomer men have better access than newcomer women? Is that what you were getting at? Or
no, it's not. Thank you for that question. It's very important. It isn't really, we didn't want to line this always up as a disparity vis-a-vis men. I mean, yes, the discussion is about inequality, but this is simply net obstacles that Canadian women immigrants face when it comes to the professions. And we recognize that this is a provincial problem in many respects because these are self-regulatory bodies that accredit, but the obstacle exists, and we're reaching out broadly to Canadians. So we did want to include it in the preambles.
Okay. And page 2, line 27 and 30, you've got a quote here, whereas Canadian women are underrepresented as participants and leaders in sports and physical activities, which affects their health and sense of social inclusion. I recognize that this can be a barrier. Many times the choices of young girls and boys, or young girls I should say, I'm sorry, but do you have, how does this underrepresentation of women in sports and physical activities affect the health and social inclusion of women? Can you give me a little bit more insight on that, please?
Yes, and I think it's really, what you're pointing to there is, it came in part from the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport and Physical Activity. Leadership positions in sport are particularly an issue, and we can certainly provide the information that we received from that organization.
Can you also show data, because I think that we have seen such an increase as well in the women's participation, whether it's our World Cup soccer teams, all of those things. We've seen a huge increase in women in participation in sport. I know that we have seen a greater access for women when it comes to opportunities for them to take part in NCAA sports as well. We have many Canadian athletes who are going down to the United States to play in sports because of the fact that you can't have the same, you don't get the same granting as you would here in Canada, or as you do in Canada. So there's things there. I'm just trying to look at the data because maybe it's because my family is so focused on sports. I see that we don't have those issues.
No, and I appreciate that, and we all recognize the tremendous outcomes and achievements by our Canadian women athletes. I mean, there's no question about that. There is also, going back to Mr. Fraser's comment, there is a rural-urban divide in access to sport, and there's also a poverty-related gap that may be specifically disproportionate for women that are heads of single households, and ensuring that young girls in those households have full access. I think that's part of the issue there, but we'll certainly provide clarification.
That would be wonderful. If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind going back to page 1, line 19 through 23. I'm just looking at line 19 through 23 and comparing it to line 15 through 23 kind of thing. You've got those intersecting. Can you just be a little bit more, I kind of see these two in the preamble being more merged. Can you tell me why they are separated? Those two thoughts?
With respect to poverty and inequality?
Whereas poverty and inequality is proportional. Yes, you've got that section. Yep. And then it continues on about the sexual orientation that's already been discussed in the transgender. So
no, that's a fair point. I think that second preambular paragraph around line 20 really goes to isolation, social isolation and vulnerability, rather than just poverty and economic inequality. So okay. They're two separate issues in our mind.
And carrying on with, I mean, like again, I said I would be supporting this. What is it that you think, at the end of the day, we do have the Day of the Girl, we do have a variety of different initiatives that we put forward, not only as an opposition, but as this government as well. Why do you think, what sort of impact do you think this week will actually have? If you don't mind sharing that.
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. And that's a question that's pervasive throughout the discussion. Two things. The first one is that this is not a celebratory bill. It was initially mischaracterized by some as being celebratory. It's not a bill where we hold up achievements of Canadian women, although we recognize them, and you'll find some language in that bill. The primary aspiration of this bill is to call the problem what it is, to be really frank and upfront with respect to the challenges, even to the point of being crass. That's quite intentional. And through that approach, I think it's really something that the bill will do that other celebratory days like International Women's Day or Day of the Girl, which are more celebratory in nature, will not achieve, will not accomplish. But the other thing is really that it, through that, what you could call as a fairly provocative approach, it seeks to engage all Canadians.
Thank you.